The city was loud, but what fell at his feet that morning was small and damp, a photograph, its corners curled from rain, the image half blurred by somebody's thumbprint. Sam Turner bent without thinking, the motion so familiar that his knees complained, and picked it up. The photo was of a woman and a child, both smiling toward an invisible camera. The woman's laugh lines were familiar, so familiar that for a moment Sam thought the image had been taken out of his own past. He had been a carpenter all his life, not one of those men who built monuments or appeared in lifestyle magazines. Sam repaired porches, installed windows, fixed the frames that held other people's lives together. His hands were maps of his work, the pale crescent callus at the base of his thumb, the steady grip that could coax a stubborn hinge into place. He carried his tool belt like an old friend, and his van like a little island of order in a city that was always on the verge of changing its mind. The small things mattered to him. How a door settled in winter, the exact pitch that kept water from finding a seam. He noticed details other people missed. The way a child's shoelaces were double-knotted and frayed, or the pattern left in wet concrete when a dog had run across it. He noticed that photograph because he noticed people. He looked up, and the photograph's owner was crouched under a bus shelter, clutching a paper cup and watching the rain as if it might teach her how to disappear. The girl was no more than 12. Her hair was braided tightly, a practical shield against weather and hunger, and there was a small bandage on the knuckle of one hand where the skin had split and scabbed over. She had an expression Sam had seen before in other people's faces, a low guardedness that had taught itself to be small. When their eyes met, she slid the photograph into her jacket like a secret and tried to stand as if she belonged to the city the way the billboards and lampposts did. Sam knelt and held the photograph out the way you hand someone a passport. "This yours?" he asked. She hesitated, wrapping her fingers round the paper until it creased. Then she nodded once, barely. "Maya," she said. He told her his name. It felt awkward, the way names can feel when you offer them across a gulf you aren't sure how to cross. He had an apron of sawdust on his jeans and the smell of strong coffee on his shirt. He offered what any carpenter would offer first, practical help. "You hungry?" She said no at first, because saying yes would make the question real. But she did follow him into a diner 2 blocks away, because there was warmth there, and because strangers with soft eyes and steady hands were rarer than sandwiches at 9 in the morning. Over eggs and black coffee, she told him little by little, as if she were letting him examine a bruise. Her mother had been gone for months, she said, sometimes a week, sometimes a month, and then longer. Maya had been moving between temporary shelters, churches that offered a cot, a friend's couch that lasted until the friend could no longer afford to host her. She had learned to carry as much as would fit in her jacket, her photograph, a spiral-bound notebook, a toothbrush with a faded cartoon on the handle. She kept the photograph because the woman in it had once told her she deserved more than a life of waiting. Sam listened in the way carpenters listen to wood, the way you lay your hand on grain to judge its give. He noticed how she talked about school the way people talk about old houses, cautious, with a list of needed repairs. He learned that in the past year she had missed more classes than she'd attended, that a social worker had placed her on a list for foster services, that she had been asked to move every time a landlord wanted the rent to go up. When she finished, Maya pushed the photograph across the table like a token. "You ever seen her?" she asked. "The woman?" Sam's throat tightened. The woman's laugh lines, the tilt of her head. He knew the face because 15 years earlier, when he was younger and less careful with promises, he'd worked on the back porch of a small house in a block that smelled of mulberry trees in the summer. A woman had been there then, hair pulled into a loose knot, with a small child who had scraped his knees every other day. He'd fixed their porch steps and left a note on the door the next week with his number, a habit he had of leaving things righted. He had meant to come back and build a tiny storage shed for them, an easy job that had never made it to the top of his list. Life had leaned in with other jobs, other people's emergencies. He had not returned. He could have shrugged and let the photograph be a thing that tugged at the edges of his memory, and nothing more. He could have gone back to his van, to his list of small, certain repairs. He could have washed his hands of the question of what it meant to owe somebody presents. Instead, he found himself saying, without a ceremony, "You got anywhere to sleep tonight?" Maya's mouth tightened in a way that suggested she had rehearsed the answer to this question 1,000 times, and it had always been either reluctance or fear. "I can sleep at the shelter," she said, "if there's space." Sam pushed his coffee cup away and put a 20 on the table. "I got a room above the shop. It's not much. It's clean, and there's a shower. You can stay one night, if you want." She looked at him as if weighing not just a bed, but an entire future. Finally, she said, "Okay." It was the first decision that mattered. Small acts stack into something like bones. The night he let her sleep above the shop, Sam woke at 3 and listened to the house breathe. He heard the soft, uncertain sounds of someone unused to a bed that did not require an eye on the door. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, went into the tiny kitchen, and made tea for 2. In the morning, over toast, Maya told him about a name, Hannah. That was the woman in the photograph. Hannah had been a year or 2 older than Sam when he had worked on the porch. She had a laugh like a bell and hands that knew how to coax seedlings into life despite a stubborn urban soil. Sam's memory came back with the texture of splintered pine, Hannah's voice, an apology for the chipped paint, a promise to repay him in time. He had believed in those cheap promises once, the same way he had believed in himself. The truth was, the world had been busy rearranging its priorities. Sam realized the choice before him had a wider edge than a night of hospitality. To keep Maya indefinitely would mean paperwork he knew nothing about. It would mean background checks, references, meetings with the agency that took the shape of bureaucracy and caution. It would mean asking people to vouch for his steadiness. It would mean stepping into a role he had not planned for, guardian, advocate, eventual defender. It would mean exposing himself to criticism, to people who would say a carpenter wasn't qualified. He made a cup of coffee and called a number he had been told to memorize for emergencies, the local child protection hotline. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Renee Brooks, a social worker who had been there long enough to sound both tired and genuinely steady. Renee listened, and then asked questions he had not known to ask. Was Maya in immediate danger? Did he have a stable address? Could he provide references? Sam answered as best he could. He told her the truth about his apartment above the shop, and that he ran his own small business. He told her about the photograph, and Hannah. Renee did not promise anything. She explained procedures, the difference between temporary placement and legal custody, the forms the state required, and the timeline they all would have to keep. She asked that Sam bring Maya to an intake appointment, and that he not let the child become invisible again. She scheduled an initial meeting at the shelter the next day. The shelter where Maya had been sleeping was a low-ceilinged building with fluorescent lights that hummed. People moved through it, with the kind of grace found only among those who have learned to make safe spaces out of inadequate ones. Sam sat in a tiny conference room while a counselor with a name tag that read Mrs. Bennett asked questions and wrote notes with a pen that scratched thinly across paper. "You can't take custody without a social worker's recommendation," Mrs. Bennett told him after they had gone through how Maya had fractured her life into pieces small enough to fit in a backpack. "What we can do is an emergency placement assessment. It doesn't mean we'll place her with you, Mr. Turner. We have obligations. Background checks, safety requirements. We have to know there's a plan. Do you have a letter from a relative?" Sam didn't. He had neighbors who brought casseroles when someone's kid needed a birthday, but no relatives in the city. He had a brother 2 states away who ran a garage and who would send a text asking whether Sam was okay with his decisions. Mrs. Bennett made a list of things he would need. 2 references, proof of income, an inspection of the sleeping space. She also made a note of the steady ring of his voice and the way he had described tiny rituals he could put in place to make the room feel like home for Maya. There was resistance layered in the room's thinness. Policies were not designed for quick heroism. They were designed to protect children from hasty choices, and often they were also the very thing that slowed protection. Sam accepted that. He did not invent urgency where there was none. He did not sulk. He started collecting what Mrs. Bennett had asked for. After the intake, Sam walked Maya back to the van, which smelled like old wood and motor oil. On the way, she pulled the photograph from her jacket and looked at it as if it were a map she couldn't yet read. "You think she's okay?" she asked. "My mom." Sam didn't know. He had 100 small guesses and no certainties. "We'll find out," he said. "But you don't have to be on the street tonight." He took her to the room above the shop. It was a box of a space with a single window that let in afternoon light. He had painted one wall a pale blue a month before because he liked how paint could change mood. There was a narrow bed, a small bookshelf with the backs of half-read novels, and a second-hand desk where he had once balanced receipts and order forms. He gave her pajamas he kept for emergencies and taught her where the extra blanket was. He did not call it charity, he called it stewardship of what he could offer. That week, Sam moved through 2 kinds of work. The visible labor of renovation, when clients wanted a staircase fixed, and the invisible labor of paperwork and calls. He phoned a man who did background checks, recommended by the shelter, and asked about requirements for home approval. He visited the building department to read the posted zoning codes aloud like a prayer. He learned the hard way that every system had its own architecture, forms that closed like doors, officials who needed to be convinced, permits that required measurements and signatures. In the evenings, when the shop smelled of cedar and the radio hummed quietly through a blues station, he sat with Maya over geometry homework and taught her how to plane a scrap of pine into something smooth enough to be used for a shelf. She was surprised by the joy of making something functional and pretty out of a piece of wood that used to be ugly. There was a small ritual that grew between them. After dinner, they would stand under the porch light and count out aloud the things they were grateful for: tea, a warm bed, a neighbor who left pies by the door. It was not therapy in a professional sense, but the ritual of naming gave a shape to their days. It reminded both of them that to stay was to make ordinary things into anchors. Word began to spread in the way small, compassionate things do. Slowly, by people telling other people. A retired electrician named Jorge, who had once hired Sam to refit his kitchen, sent a toolbox and a thermos of stew. Mrs. Hargreaves from down the street left a bag of kids' clothes neatly folded with notes about sizes and seasons. A young woman who had been in and out of shelters 2 years prior came by and taught Maya a simple breathing exercise she used to get through panic attacks. None of these were headline moments. They were a string of hands reaching across small distances. Not everyone applauded. A landlord on the block, an owner of modest rental properties who kept watch over his investments, saw Sam leading a parade of volunteers carrying plywood and paint, and immediately imagined headlines: unauthorized housing, zoning problems, liability. He delivered a terse letter, warning of potential fines. Sam took it home and read it twice, the ink blurring at the smear of a coffee cup ring. It was an early reminder that the world often mistook small acts of necessity for flaunting the rules. He filed the letter and kept working. The forms were not the only obstacle. There was a kind of social skepticism that could be as debilitating as red tape. "He's a good man, but he isn't a social service," one neighbor said in a grocery line, meaning it as both compliment and question. Who is he to step in? Others saw Sam's steadiness and felt relieved. "He'll do us right," they whispered. The town settled into arguing with itself in small places, leaving the choice up to those who would speak loudly enough to be heard. One day, a woman in a smart jacket and a purse that cost more than Sam's toolbox cornered Maya outside a coffee shop. "Your grandmother called," she said in a tone that was equal parts deliverer of news and executioner of security. "She says the child belongs with family. She wants to apply for custody." Maya's jaw tightened in a way that made Sam ache. Family was a complicated word. Sometimes it opened doors, sometimes it slammed them. The woman had papers. She said she worked with family services for an agency that served to reunite children when possible. She did not look at Sam when she spoke. "We'll need to see documentation," she told Maya. "Birth certificate. Any proof of guardianship. If you want to stay in emergency housing, we'll help. But we can't put you in someone's home without checks." Sam called the man Renee had recommended, Elliot Callahan, a volunteer attorney who ran a small community legal aid clinic out of a room that smelled of older books and index cards. Callahan did not take big cases for money. He took the ones that needed someone to hold the system's hand and remind it of its purpose. He listened to Sam without interruption and then said, "We can do this step by step." He explained that family claims could be valid, that a grandparent might have rights even if the child had been living on the street, but that the process would be procedural and would not automatically strip Sam of the ability to help Maya. He asked for the photograph and examined it like a piece of evidence that was also a talisman. Then he said the word that brought both relief and a responsibility that felt like a lengthening shadow. Temporary custody, with the agency's approval, could be possible. But we have to build a case that your home provides stability and that you're not an interim stop. We'll need references, a home study, and commitments to education and medical care. We'll also have to show that the biological family's rights are considered. Sam went back to the shop and sat on a bench he had built himself when he was 20. He ran his hands over the smooth edge and thought of permanence. He had not set out to be anybody's champion. He had set out to be someone who fixed things, but perhaps fixing things could be more than skill. Perhaps it could be allegiance to someone who had been let go by most of the systems that were supposed to hold them. He started documenting. Receipts for electricity and rent, photos of the room above the shop, notes from the shelter, a letter from Mrs. Hargreaves who attested to his character. He told his regular clients a pared-back version of the story. Most nodded and offered support. Some were cautious. He recruited volunteers who could run errands, who could help paint, who could take shifts teaching basic carpentry to kids at the shelter. The work took on the quietly strategic rhythm of a small campaign. Meetings, checklists, a simple website page he had his nephew set up with photos, and a calendar of volunteer shifts. Meanwhile, Maya began to show small changes. The first night she slept through until 6 without waking up convinced Sam that the room was doing what rooms are meant to do. Hold you safe until the world's edges sharpen again. She signed up for algebra class with help from a counselor and on a whim asked Sam if she could learn to use a chisel. "You'll learn to respect the grain," he told her. And she listened the way someone listens when they are trying not to get used to being trusted. In the shop, he handed her a block of beech and showed her how the blade must be kept at the right angle so the wood surrendered in thin curls. The work was a new language. It taught patience. It taught that progress could be measured in millimeters, in the smoothness of a corner. For Maya, the lesson felt like a small miracle. She could make something hold that before had been only memory. A cluster of small donors appeared too. An anonymous check in the mail for tools, a community theatre that held a bake sale and gave him a box of coins, a grant from a local foundation that funded training for at-risk youth. They were not enough to build a neighborhood, but they were enough to patch a roof, to lay a concrete pad for a small shed, to buy a set of bunk beds for the shelter where other kids could sleep when the beds were full. Sam and Elliot stood at a municipal building one morning, a briefcase between them, paperwork fanned like proof of intent. The clerk behind the counter examined their packet and placed a stamp. It felt official, in a way that was both encouraging and perfunctory. The inspector would come next week to certify the space for temporary placement. Sam made coffee for the volunteers that afternoon and taped a list of needs on the community board. Child-sized winter coats, a tutor for geometry, a piano teacher. Still, for every small victory, there was a tightening of pressure. The landlord's earlier letter had been only a warning. Now a different type of friction appeared. A zoning official sent an email questioning whether converting the upstairs room into a long-term living space required a variance. The city's codebook, when you read it under fluorescent light, offered 1,000 ways for a well-meaning plan to stall. Sam took each question in stride, the way you take each cut. Clean it up, sand it, fit the joint properly. There were days when doubt crept in like a cold. He found himself awake at odd hours considering the calculus of risk, not only to himself, but to a child whose trust he had invited. He thought of the money that went into tools, of the old debts he had paid off the year he decided to put safety above profit. He thought of the times he'd been called a hand and not a father. He had no illusions that he would change the world's structures by himself. The project was never about a single man's redemption. It was about refusing to abandon someone when the world made that abandonment easy. The first house they properly rehabilitated began as something ordinary. A row house 2 blocks from the shop with a sagging porch and a forlorn "for sale" sign. Sam had noticed the house because its boarded-up windows made it conspicuous in an otherwise busy block. He had asked the realtor after work one evening whether they could look at the bones. The agency that owned the property, a small non-profit that tended to reuse buildings for social good projects, was willing to negotiate a short-term lease if Sam could present a plan. He presented blueprints that were hand-drawn and honest, a spreadsheet that showed costs, and an imagined schedule of volunteers. He brought a quote from a thrift store for curtains, and an email from a local lumber yard offering a discount. They said yes, with the caveat that he would need a public hearing if the plan expanded beyond single-family use. He accepted. He hired Jorge the electrician to rewire the place and found a small team of volunteers willing to spend weekends patching the roof and pulling nails. The first night they worked on the house, Sam brought pizza and a radio and set out plastic cups and the kind of folding chairs that remembered other meetings. The crew arrived, some with experience, some with calluses from different trades, some who had once been homeless and now carried a different balance of fault and freedom. There was no pageantry, only sweat and the slow metronomic music of work. They flipped floors. They installed insulation. They painted rooms in gentle colors, chosen because they reflected light better and seemed to invite people in instead of shutting them out. They put up a coat rack near the door that would later be used without thought, coats and scarves hanging like small flags of survival. Sam taught Maya how to measure twice and cut once, and she held the tape while he cut, learning by watching how he corrected mistakes without scolding. News of the first house spread in human-sized increments. A local paper ran a small column about a Carpenter-led initiative and got facts wrong in modest ways that made Sam smile and roll his eyes. The piece brought donations that were enough to buy a washing machine and a couch. It brought volunteers who had never wielded a paintbrush and discovered they liked the motion of transformation. It brought more scrutiny from officials who wanted to ensure that everything was by the book. The first occupant of the rehabilitated house was a woman named Lena, who had been living in a 12-step recovery program and who had a daughter at a foster placement. She moved in with a crescent of caution and a hope so small you could hold it in the palm of your hand. Sam kept his distance at first, giving her the space to unbox memories and rearrange shelves. He fixed her broken cabinet hinge, not with ceremony, but as a quiet promise. The hinge would hold. That held more meaning than a speech. As the project unfolded, critics found openings. An op-ed appeared in an online column asking whether a carpenter could run a social program and whether volunteers could substitute for training and oversight. Sam read it once, and then set the paper upside down and went to work. He had conversations with the city's child services coordinator, with Mrs. Bennett, who had now become an ally on certain days, and with Elliot, who reminded him of the need to document everything. "You don't need to respond to every critic," Elliot advised. "You need to demonstrate the work is rigorous, consistent, and accountable." They started keeping records with a clean, municipal seriousness. Intake forms, progress notes from councillors, volunteer logs, sign-in sheets, a ledger of donations and expenditures. The administration of care needed the same attention as the craft of building. Sam learned to like the discipline of it because it gave a structure to things that felt otherwise fragile. Months in, the project had delivered its first real miracle. An evening where neighbors gathered in the new house and the children who lived there played hide-and-seek in rooms that had been empty for years. Someone brought a battered guitar. Someone else taught a chorus of simple songs. Maya sat on a stool and listened, fingers sticky with pizza, and laughed with a sound that was not small anymore. Sam sat at a doorway and watched. He felt tired in his bones, but right in the place that counted. Yet complication arrived as it always does. A letter, an unsigned complaint, a small legal flashpoint. A woman named Dorothy Carlyle, a distant relative of Hannah whom Sam had not known existed, appeared with a stack of papers asserting that Hannah's parental rights should be reinstated and that Maya should be placed back with family. Dorothy insisted she had the child's best interest at heart and that Sam, as a non-relative, could not be trusted with long-term guardianship. Her voice was calm in meetings, the sort of calm that carried the weight of money and connections. She had friends in municipal offices, and crucially, she had time and the capacity to pursue things relentlessly. The agency called a meeting. Maya sat with her mouth pressed in a thin line, the photograph of her mother held between her knees. Sam sat beside her, hands folded, and listened while the agency explained legal processes and timelines. Dorothy said, plainly, that the law favored family reunification when possible. Elliot argued that reunification was a worthy goal, but not at the cost of a child's safety or stability. He recommended a middle course, a period of supervised visitation and an evaluation to determine whether Hannah, or any family, could provide a stable home. He wrote a memo and filed it. The agency promised to take all factors into account. That night, after the hearing, Sam walked the block with Maya. They passed the house with the porch he had once fixed, the one that had sat in his memory like a missing step. He pointed to it and told Maya the story of the loose board he had promised to fix, and never had. He said it not as apology. There is a humility to owning past failures, but as a promise that could be renewed. "People make promises they can't keep," he said, "but you can make new promises now." Maya listened. "So what happens if she comes back?" she asked, voice small. "Then we do what the professionals tell us," Sam said. "We make sure there's a plan. We don't jump to conclusions. We don't let anyone rush the kid into a change that could hurt her more." It was an answer shaded with legal realities and human tenderness. It was not heroic. It was precise. The work was growing into something that required systems. Sam began thinking beyond one house. He imagined clusters of small, modest homes where people could come off the street and have not only a bed, but a place to learn skills that made them employable, a community kitchen that was more than a soup line, an after-school room for kids who needed a place to do homework and not to be the adult in someone else's story. He thought of a model where residents had a voice in how spaces were run, where they might earn sweat equity, helping to build their own homes in exchange for a stake in the community, and where a consistent staff provided social work and job training. He shared the idea with Jorge, who scratched his chin and said, You know that's a big thing, Sam. That's not a porch step. That's running a small city. Sam knew that. He also knew that everything big begins with a first nail. The next morning he sat down with a pad of paper and began sketching. He drew rows of small houses with front porches, a communal garden where kids could learn to plant carrots, a workshop where people could learn trades. He wrote numbers in the margins: volunteer hours, material costs, a timeline that stretched like a raw plank waiting to be planned. He felt the familiar thrill carpenters feel when planning takes shape. The moment between imagination and build, when the world allows itself to become something better to use. But the very act of imagining public projects attracts public attention. Dorothy, who had been watching, began to mobilize local objections, concerns about property values, the strain on parking, the changing character of the neighborhood. A petition appeared online asking the city to block any variance for non-traditional housing in the block. A local council member received a call from a constituent concerned about temporary encampments becoming permanent. The language shifted from argument about an individual child's welfare to debates about urban policy and neighborhood identity. All of this made the work slower. It also made it more visible. Sam found himself at public meetings where planners spoke in measured tones and residents expressed fears that were sometimes reasonable and sometimes rooted in worry. He learned to answer with clarity and data, projections about traffic, evidence from other small-scale housing programs, letters of support from community leaders who had seen the difference of a safe night. He learned to separate those who were afraid of change from those whose complaints were administrative and resolvable. Through it all, Maya kept learning geometry and the way a straight line could be trusted. She began to help in the shop, sanding a plank with concentration at her face that made Sam think of the first time he had taught someone to plane wood. He taught her to measure windows, to hold a chisel with both precision and gentleness. The act of learning anchored her, and anchoring other people became his preferred method of influence. A week before the inspection that would determine whether the house could be used as a temporary placement, Sam received a call from Elliot. "There's a hearing," Elliot said. "Dorothy's petition is moving faster than we'd hoped. She wants a quick review of family claims. It doesn't mean the court will expedite custody decisions, but it does mean we should be ready." Sam felt the weight of the choice he had already made. He had pledged presence. He had gathered collaborators. He had designed a modest but replicable model. To stand down now would mean risking the very thing he had promised, a place to sleep for a child who had been awake for too many nights. He squared his shoulders, wiped sawdust off his jeans, and went to the shop. He had no illusions about spectacle. He had no need for a microphone or a viral video. He needed, in the most practical sense, to be ready. The house sealed, the paperwork ordered, the references at the ready. He tightened screws and tightened plans. He called a meeting for the volunteers and told them the news. There would be a hearing, and people would need to show up, not as protesters, but as witnesses to routine, responsible care. Before he left that afternoon, he pinned a short note on the community board above the shop calendar. It was a simple line: "If this story matters to you, consider sharing it with someone who cares about safe places." It was the kind of small, public ask that fit the work, a single nudge toward community, not an advertisement for a savior. They finished the last board on the porch at dusk, and the first house glowed from within, as if lit by the small delight of completion. Maya hung a crooked curtain that made her laugh, and Lena arranged mismatched mugs with an attention that had the solemnity of someone claiming a territory of normalcy. Sam stood on the sidewalk and listened to the house breathe with its new sashes and locks. For a moment, he allowed himself a private satisfaction that was both simple and profound. Then the phone rang. The news it carried changed the shape of the next days. Dorothy had filed an urgent motion. A hearing was scheduled. The city inspector wanted an additional fire safety evaluation. Donors asked questions, Volunteers worried about legal exposure. The work was now an orchestra of craft, law, and care, and every instrument mattered. Sam looked back at the house, and then at Maya, doing homework at the kitchen table under a light that cut a square of concentration from the dimness outside. He thought about promise, those he'd kept, and those he'd let slide. He heard the tool belt jostle at his hip like a reminder of the work ahead. There was a long way to go, many small acts to sustain, many systems to navigate. The path would require endurance more than spectacle. He inhaled, tasted the dust and the late summer air, and walked toward the shop, where a stack of permits lay waiting for his signature. He put a cup of coffee on the counter and began making calls. He was ordinary in his clothes and extraordinary in his persistence. He had no plans for heroism beyond staying. That, he had learned, was the most dangerous and the most effective decision anyone could make. The week of the hearing felt like a hammering on the shop door. Sam moved through it, with the habit of someone who understands the rhythm of work. One hand steady, the other making lists. He and Elliot compiled binders, intake forms, the shelter's notes, medical records showing routine care, the inspector's preliminary observations, letters from volunteers and neighbors. Mrs. Bennett agreed to come and speak. Lena and a couple of other residents prepared brief statements about how the house had changed nights into anchors. Maya, for all her carefulness, would speak too. About school and the way a room that stays warm all night can do strange things to the size of your worries. On the morning of the hearing, the municipal building hummed with the kind of official tense air Sam had only once felt before, the day he'd filed for a permit to build the first house. People in the project wore the paradoxical uniform of ordinary change. Paint-streaked jeans, work boots, hands that testified to hours spent lifting. Volunteers from the neighborhood, faces that had become familiar at pizza nights and weekends of framing, filled the back row of the hearing room. A reporter from the local paper sat near the clerk, taking notes. A small notebook folded and refolded as if to remember everything about something it had no story for yet. Dorothy arrived with the polish of someone trained in not being noticed until it was useful to be. She had an attorney who spoke in halting certainties and a stack of documents that smelled faintly of something expensive. She read a brief about family rights and the statute that favored reunification, and then looked at Maya as if by staring she could summon the past into a tidy order. The hearing itself was procedural and human, a peculiar blend of both. The judge, an even-handed woman whose eyes suggested she had once mended something that did not fit, listened to testimony in the way Sam tried to listen to a stubborn hinge. Elliot presented the binder they'd compiled with a simple, direct voice. He framed the case not as a battle of personalities, but as a question of stability and trauma recovery. Mrs. Bennett explained intake procedures and what the shelter could and could not provide. Lena, nervous but steady, spoke about the smallness of being given a space and the largeness of what that made possible. When it was Maya's turn, she spoke quietly at first, then with a steadiness that surprised Sam. She told the room about a night when she had walked until her feet ached and then found a doorway to rest against. About how learning to plane a plank had taught her something she could keep. About the way she slept without counting exits in the house Sam had done up. She did not indict Hannah or Dorothy. She spoke about being tired of having her life managed by forms and promises that slid away. "I just wanted someone to not leave," she said simply. The judge's pen stopped mid-scratch. Dorothy's counsel argued that family reunification was the state's preference and that due process required they consider those rights carefully. Elliot answered with documentation of the process he and Sam had followed, a timeline of outreach to relatives, and the clear evidence that immediate placement with Sam offered the safest option, short-term. The barbed question, could a carpenter be entrusted with a child's long-term welfare, hung in the air like dust motes. The judge made a ruling that was measured and, to Sam, almost painfully ordinary. Maya would remain in Sam's care under a temporary custody order while a family evaluation proceeded. There would be supervised visitations if Hannah or any family members came forward with substantiation, and the court requested follow-up reports from the shelter and from Elliot every 60 days. It was not a dramatic victory. It was procedure, a series of steps that would make the child's presence in Sam's life legitimate and protect both Maya and Sam from rushed decisions. Outside the courtroom, the crowd breathed as if a long-held shape had relaxed. People clapped quietly, not because the law had proven love, but because the mechanics of care had found a temporary alignment with the thing that had seemed urgent. Dorothy, restrained and unbowed, left with promises to pursue family contacts. Sam shook hands with Elliot and Mrs. Bennett, then walked Maya down a corridor of volunteers who offered small congratulations and bigger commitments. Carpentry lessons to fill after school hours, a scholarship request form one neighbor tucked into his palm like a talisman. The legal breathing space allowed the work to expand without improvisation. Sam registered a small non-profit to organize donations and volunteers. He drafted bylaws with help from Elliot and a volunteer accountant who smelled faintly of coffee and peace. The name they chose, Hearthside Commons, felt like the most honest of compromises. It described a place whose purpose was warmth and gathering, less an institution and more a neighborly promise codified into tax forms. Scaling required what carpenters call joinery, the right connections aligned carefully. Sam forged relationships with a pair of small non-profits that provided on-site social work hours in exchange for a modest room in the administrative house. A community college agreed to run an apprenticeship certification program out of the workshop so volunteers could get recognized hours toward job placement. A local supplier offered reclaimed lumber at a discount, and Jorge's electrician co-op agreed to oversee wiring by trainees under licensed supervision. None of it was glamorous. It was logistics and patience, the structure of networks rather than the headline of a single act. Money came in many shapes. A neighborhood bake sale netted enough for a year's insurance. A foundation offered a seed grant for vocational training after a careful review of their program goals. Dozens of small donors began giving monthly amounts, $30 here, $50 there, enough to make payroll for a community coordinator and to pay for a counselor's hours. When a crowdfunding campaign exceeded expectations, Sam insisted they earmark half the funds for long-term reserve rather than immediate expansion. He had learned the hard lesson of sudden money. Without systems, it can flatten rather than lift. Progress was not linear. Winter brought a storm that ripped up the tarps on an unfinished roof and exposed a framing member weakened by an unseen rot. The inspector condemned the partially completed structure until it was reinforced, and several volunteers, spread thin, had to pause. A major donor who had promised a matching grant delayed her support pending more rigorous accounting. Dorothy's influence did not evaporate. Her quiet criticisms appeared in city meetings and in a social media thread that spun concern into rumor, claims that Hearthside's houses would lower property values or invite dependency. Sam learned to treat public skepticism as another kind of repair. Listen, document, answer with facts and humility. He arranged a public tour of the workshop and the first few houses, handing out sheets that explained permits, safety measures, and resident governance. He invited critics to meet the residents and hear their stories, not as spectacle but as testimony to an ordinary human fact. People want to be safe and to contribute. Some visitors left unconvinced. Others signed up to volunteer. Inside the houses, slow work went on. Each unit came with a small apprenticeship, someone learning to tile, another learning to hang doors. That hands-on experience mattered as much as the roof. It altered how residents thought of themselves. They were not only recipients, they were makers. Residents who had once lived in the shelter now supervised volunteers on weekends and taught children to pound nails safely. The project became, quietly, a school of practical dignity. As Hearthside grew to 10 houses, a new challenge arose. Municipal zoning disputed whether the pattern of clustered dwellings met neighborhood codes. City planners called for a public hearing to review the variants for a larger pilot cluster. Dorothy seized the moment, organizing neighbors into a formal opposition and turning up at every community meeting with carefully folded notes. She argued that the project needed more professional oversight and questioned the long-term sustainability of houses run by volunteers. Her tone was cool, her arguments lined with legal references that carried weight with people who read policy memos for pleasure. Sam could have appealed to anger. He could have chosen rhetorical flourishes or viral stunts. Instead, he did what he knew best. He organized a calendar of public testimonies. He brought families who had found the first house to speak about small things, sleeping without panic, a child able to do homework at a table at night. He brought the retired teacher, who now ran a literacy program in the workshop, and the former electrician, who had become a mentor for adolescents. Maya, older now, stood before the council and spoke with a clear, practical voice. She described the apprenticeship program and how it led one young person to a paid job with a contractor. She said, without melodrama, that stability mattered in the way a foundation matters to a house. Without it, everything else is just decoration. The council voted to pilot a cluster of 5 additional houses on a conditional basis. Hearthside must meet specific safety metrics, provide a plan for resident governance, hire a trained case manager, and submit quarterly reports. It was a measured approval, a city doing what a city must do, granting permission while insisting on accountability. For a while, the work settled into a rhythm that looked almost like peace. But one late spring, an unexpected blow arrived. An inspection unearthed faulty connections in one of the older unit's electrical sub-panels. No one was hurt, but the image traveled fast. Dorothy's supporters used the incident as proof that volunteer-run projects were reckless. A foundation rescinded a pledge pending a full independent audit. The setback mattered because it fed doubt among volunteers and donors. Sam sat in the shop late that night with a list of things that needed to be fixed and counted the cost, not only in dollars, but in trust. He could have reacted by defending every decision in a long letter. Instead, he called Jorge and asked him to spearhead an independent safety review and asked Elliot to help formulate a transparent corrective plan. He invited the city inspector to walk through the remediation with them. He took responsibility publicly, not as an act of penance, but as an act of governance. "We screwed up," he told a small gathering in the workshop that week. "We will fix it and make sure it never repeats. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to watch us make it right." That kind of humility worked in ways blunt force could not. Volunteers returned. Donors who cared about process more than perfection felt reassured. The audit cleared them after the fixes were implemented, and the foundations that had paused support resumed with cautious optimism. Years slid forward, measured in ribbon cuttings, and the quiet accumulation of household rituals. The project extended beyond rehabbing row houses to include purpose-built units designed with input from residents. The architectural plans were modest. Single-story, energy-efficient homes with front porches, raised beds for gardening, and a shared common house with a kitchen where meals could be prepared collectively. Funding arrived through a blend of small grants, city support for transitional housing, and an innovative partnership with a local technical school that supplied apprentices in exchange for curriculum credits. One of the most important developments was the birth of a resident council, a group elected by people living in Hearthside that created rules about shared spaces, a conflict resolution process, and a small budget for community activities. Sam insisted the council be empowered, not just advisory. "If we're serious about dignity," he said, "then the people who live here must make the rules." Maya chaired the first council meeting, sleeves rolled up, the same fingers that had once held a chisel now tracing minutes and action points. Residents voted on a community garden plan that turned a barren lot into rows of vegetables. They organized a weekly potluck that moved neighbors from polite nods to real conversation. As houses multiplied, 20, 30, 50, the model began to attract attention from other neighborhoods. Other small groups mimicked the method: local carpenters, soup kitchens, community colleges. Hearthside planners wrote a short how-to manual, not as an instruction set for circumventing rules, but as a guide for building partnerships. How to work with permitting offices, how to structure volunteer supervision, how to embed social services. Sam insisted the manual emphasize staying, consistent support, rather than quick, flashy wins. Maya's role evolved alongside the houses. Teenagers who had once shown up out of curiosity became apprentices and later staff. She ran the youth apprenticeship program, teaching measurement and safety, and she learned grant writing to support a small tutoring budget. Her voice carried weight at city meetings. When she spoke about the impact of a warm room on a child's ability to learn fractions, even cautious bureaucrats listened. She had become not only the child who arrived with a photograph, but a leader whose presence remade the possibilities for others. Opposition, too, evolved. Dorothy retained supporters, and sometimes used procedural challenges to slow expansions. She filed a challenge when the city considered converting a block of derelict garages into 5 new modular units. The legal question hinged on use classifications and parking offsets. The debate became technical and wearisome. But politics often bends toward presence. Sam, Maya, Elliot, Mrs. Bennett, and a coalition of residents met with planners and traffic engineers. They committed to paid parking management, hired a local firm to do an impact study, and proposed a small community benefit fund that would pay for street trees and lighting. The decisive moment came in a winter council meeting 5 years after the photograph first slipped to the pavement. Hearthside had reached 50 houses, and the plan on the table was bold. A larger parcel the city had designated as surplus land could be repurposed for a permanent village if they could prove long-term management and resident governance. The opposition framed the proposal as risky. Dorothy warned of temporary intent becoming permanent liability. The council considered denying the rezoning. Sam and his team did what they had always done. They showed up with people whose lives had quietly changed. A woman who had been homeless and was now a licensed culinary assistant spoke about the dignity of having a space for practice. A man who'd once been chronically unemployed held up a paycheck. Maya, now 20, stood before the council with a folder of signatures, residents who wanted oversight and who had a plan to form a resident trust to own and operate homes. The presenter from the city planning department, usually cautious and circumspect, said the pilot had lowered calls for emergency shelter in its area and improved school attendance metrics among children who had been housed there. The council was persuaded, but set an onerous condition that struck at the heart of permanence. The land could be sold on a long-term lease only if Hearthside established a legally binding resident-governed trust and demonstrated a plan for fiscal sustainability. It was the standard the city used to ensure private initiatives did not evaporate when a key donor left. It was also the moment at which Sam faced a choice: continue to steer the project as its founder, or formalize resident ownership and step back. He consulted Elliot and the resident council. They drafted the trust's charter so that residents would hold majority seats. And Sam insisted that the trust include clauses guaranteeing staff continuity and maintenance funds funded through a mix of rents scaled to income and a city subsidy for supportive services. The plan required one more sacrifice. Sam agreed to transfer ownership of the initial row houses he had renovated, the ones that had started the movement, into the trust. It was a legal act that gave what he had built to the people who needed it most. The transfer was not simple. It meant relinquishing a kind of control he had held on to instinctively. He had poured savings into renovations, had taken loans that he still owed. The legal team crafted terms that protected Sam's creditors and ensured the trust could take on financial obligations without exposing residents to undue risk. When the day came to sign, he felt the same sharp little feeling he had the first time he sanded a board until it shone. A combination of loss and completion. At the trust formation meeting, residents and volunteers circled a conference table. Maya, wearing a sweater that smelled faintly of paint and coffee, spoke on behalf of the newly formed board. "These homes belong to us now," she said. "We will care for them and for each other. Sam will be our head carpenter, not our landlord. This way, when donors leave and times get hard, the homes stay where they are, with people who live in them." Sam signed the deed with a hand that trembled slightly. For the first time since the photograph had fallen at his feet, he felt the shape of what staying meant in hard legal terms. Structures that outlast an individual's capacity and protect against the contingencies of life. There was a celebration that afternoon, low-key and human. Someone brought a violin, someone else baked pies, and children braided each other's hair with a concentration that made adults laugh quietly. Dorothy did not come. There would always be those who would not see the value of giving power to those they felt were not yet trustworthy. But there were enough people who did. Growth continued, patient and sometimes bumpy. Hearthside added programs that mattered. A mobile clinic that visited once a week, a job placement liaison who helped apprentices find work, and a small lending library started by a retired teacher. They opened a community storefront where residents practiced baking and sold goods to the neighborhood at market prices. It was not a panacea. There were relapses and evictions, and nights when a resident sat awake worrying about a medication they couldn't afford. But the pattern of care had changed. Neighbors now noticed and intervened. There were emergency funds and a formalized duty roster for night checks. Maya's arc became a small parable of the project's ethic. She finished high school, worked as an apprentice during the day, and took community college classes at night. When a local carpentry contractor offered a full-time job with benefits, she declined. Not because the money was insufficient, but because she had decided her place was here, training others. She became a staff member, then a program director, and at 26, she led the Youth Apprenticeship Initiative and coordinated outreach to schools. She taught kids to sight a board and to trust that repetition could build competence. When children learned to make a dovetail joint, they learned also that patience yielded something strong. As Hearthside built beyond 50 houses, their fundraising model matured. They applied for and received multi-year operational grants from a combination of municipal sources and private foundations. But it was the accumulation of small monthly donors that gave them the steadiness of a heartbeat. Sam often said the difference between a flurry and a foundation was regular giving. 200 people who give $10 a month, he'd say, are worth more than one person who writes a check and expects us to be grateful forever. A few years later, when they passed the 100th home, there was no single headline claiming miraculous salvation. Instead, there were dozens of small stories that, braided together, made a narrative of endurance. A man named Marco, once chronically unemployed, now ran the storefront bakery and mentored apprentices. Lena received word from a caseworker that her child would be returning home, reunification achieved slowly and with a support plan. A young woman learned to drive and began taking clients for deliveries, a job that paid enough for her to support her 2 children. The community garden produced enough kale and tomatoes that they distributed surplus to a nearby food pantry. The ceremonial marking of the 100th house was modest. A potluck in the common house, speeches short and honest. People read brief notes written years earlier, letters from residents describing their first nights in a Hearthside home, and posted them on a wall near the kitchen like evidence that ordinary choices ripple. Elliot, hair grey at the temples and still fond of the crease of an argument, reminded everyone that rules and process had kept the project from becoming a flash in the pan. Mrs. Bennett, who had been present at the first intake, watched children run by and said nothing because the sight spoke for itself. Sam stood in the doorway and watched people move through rooms he had helped build. He was older, shoulders squared in the same way they'd always been, but there was a softness around his mouth now that came from having given things away and watched them persist. Maya came by his side and leaned into him. The years between them folded into a small softness. "You look tired," she said. "I am," he admitted. "But good tired. That's a different kind." She smiled. "You did it," she said. "I didn't do it alone," he corrected. "You did it. The neighbors, the electricians, Jorge, people who showed up with food and with hands." They walked later when the sun was low, and the porches threw long shadows across the sidewalk, back to the shop for a moment. The photograph that had begun it all was pinned behind his workbench in a small frame, edges yellowed. It had faded more with time, but not in meaning. Hannah's face, whomever she had been, wherever she was a memory held tenderly. Sam had never found out everything about her story. Sometimes the past refuses the tidy closure we hope for. But the photograph was now part of a larger tapestry. Atop the workbench lay a small, worn hammer, its handle smoothed from years of work. Sam picked it up, feeling the familiar weight, and then set it down again. He no longer measured himself by the hammer alone. He measured the morning he let a child sleep above his shop and the 100 houses that followed. He measured nights when children finally slept without counting exits. Time, in the end, had given Hearthside the thing it needed most: continuity. It had also given Sam a lesson in how to leave without abandoning. When the trust reached maturity, Sam stepped back from administrative duties to teach full-time in the workshop. He accepted fewer commercial jobs and spent mornings with apprentices and afternoons in community meetings. He loved the chop of routine and the subtle miracle of ordinary work becoming public good. Dorothy stopped appearing at meetings as often. People who once supported her found reasons to be quiet in the presence of steady evidence. It is not that every critic went away. Some skepticism remains healthy. But the chorus of support that had once been tentative had become a majority. Years later, when a reporter asked Sam what he thought his legacy would be, he shook his head like someone amused by the idea of his own importance. "Legacy isn't a plaque," he said. "It's the people you refuse to walk away from. It's the kid who learns to measure a board and then feeds their family because of what they learned. It's the fact that a place keeps its doors open when others close." He said it not as boast, but as a summation of the long work. No magic, no showmanship, just a steady accrual of small, accountable acts. Maya, nearby, rolled a measuring tape around her wrist like a bracelet and listened. On a quiet morning years after the photograph had fallen at his feet, Sam returned to the city corner where he'd first found Maya. The bus shelter had been replaced and the lampposts had been trimmed. A new cafe had taken the place of a shop that once sold broken lamps. People moved through the corner with the indifferent focus of city life. Sam paused and watched. His hands smelled of cedar and varnish, even in the cool air. He placed his palm on the wooden bench of the bus shelter, feeling the grain and a small steadiness. A young woman sat down nearby with a photograph in her pocket, tugging at it as if its edges steadied her. He recognized the gesture because it had been his own once. He did not approach with fanfare. He simply offered a thermos of coffee, the small, habitual kindness he'd given Maya on the first morning they met. She accepted and smiled, a brief, bright thing. Sam nodded and walked away down the block toward the workshop, to a place where tools waited and apprentices sharpened planes, where a community kept an ordinary promise. Behind him, the corner hummed on, a city of busy things, but now with people better protected. The houses continued to hold space for strangers and sometimes for kin. Bloodlines, like photographs, are part of life. But the truest measure of the work Sam had done was not in reunions or headlines. It was in nights when a child slept through without checking the door, in the sound of laughter in a kitchen that had once been empty, in a resident board that resolved disputes not with edicts, but with conversation. It was in the way a small village of homes could resist the cold logic of disposability by insisting on maintenance and care. If there is a short lesson in the story, it is this: you do not have to be famous to change the arc of someone's life. You do not need an army of donors or a charismatic branding campaign. What matters is presence, consistent, diligent, accountable presence. You build not just houses, but practices that outlast your own hands. If this story resonates with you and you want to help where you live, consider looking up tiny house villages, local housing collaboratives, or volunteer programs in your community. Small, sustained commitments, an hour teaching, a monthly donation, showing up to a council meeting, add up. People who once had to live in the margins can, with steady neighbors and practical structures, find places where they are welcomed and where they can learn to stay. Sam walked into the shop and set down his thermos. The radio played quietly while someone sanded in the corner. Apprentices laughed when a plane bit too deeply into a board and then corrected the cut with the calmness of people who had learned to keep working. He breathed in the smell of wood and oil and knew, with a kind of tired rightness, that what he had built would be counted not by numbers alone, but by the people it kept from being left out in the cold. That, in the end, was the measure of a life worth the work.